We got breaking news in the NFL when it comes to former judge Sue L. Robinson. She has ruled that Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson should be suspended 6 games per multiple reports. That coming down today. No appeal from the NFLPA. NFL can appeal ruling here. This all coming, of course, with Deshaun Watson in camp throughout all this going down with all those allegations towards him since he got traded from Houston, now in Cleveland. The reports coming down that Deshaun Watson expected to be suspended for 6 games in the 2022 season. For more of this breaking news here, Ryan Harris tapping in, and your reaction. Of course, we knew he was going to miss some games the way it seemed coming into this moment, but now that he's going to miss 6, your reaction to this news coming out today?
Well, first and foremost, it's 6 games for breaching the conduct policy, so behaving in a manner that negatively reflects on the NFL. It's going to get sticky here because people are going to want guilt, people are going to want innocence and justice. But if you're a football player on the Browns, your season still has a chance to be special. Now, whether, again, that's just or right or wrong, who knows? But this is what's happening moving forward. And I applaud the NFL and the NFLPA going through a first-time process of where they have a third party independently looking at all of the information. Because in the past, Roger Goodell makes a decision, and then the teams have to appeal to him. But here, players feel like they, at least under this new CBA agreement, have an opportunity to have facts presented and get some leeway in terms of the person making the decision also isn't the commissioner. But this is going to be big because the beginning of the season is nothing like the middle part in the end, which is where they're going to need Deshaun Watson. So for the Cleveland Browns, if you're a player on the roster for the Cleveland Browns, you have a little more hope. And if you're Deshaun Watson, you're thankful you get to play football for the first time in over a year. And I'm not sure what you feel if you're any of the victims who have alleged the actions of Deshaun Watson. I'm sure you wanted more. I'm sure you wanted more of an impact. But this is something that at least you have an answer now here in the beginning of August.
Missing those 6 games, as you look at the schedule right there, his possible return would be Week 7 at the Baltimore Ravens. You talk about hope there with the Browns, knowing that QB1 won't be there. They do have an in-house option that they signed this offseason, Jacoby Brissett. What does this mean for the Browns team? Can they hang on there the first 6 games? How do they look with him at the helm while Watson is out there?
Well, they look like a running team with Jacoby Brissett at the helm. Now, Jacoby Brissett is very capable. His best year was in New England under Josh McDaniels. He threw for over 3,000 yards, but he has an interception issue. He has a bit of a longer throwing motion. His processing has sped up while he's been in the NFL. So if you're Jacoby Brissett, you want to go 5-2 at least to keep your team in the AFC North contention for the title. You want to get some good standing. So you have to win multiple games if you're Jacoby Brissett. And then they also have Josh Dobbs. And Kevin Stefanski, the head coach of the Browns, has said that Josh Dobbs has played very, very well in the spring and into this training camp. And then, of course, they got Josh Rosen. Someday we'll get to 30 for 30 on what happened to Josh Rosen. But Jacoby Brissett, Joshua Dobbs, you got to go at least 5-2 if you want to keep some playoff chances alive for the Browns.
Brian, put this in perspective for us. When you have a guy like Deshaun Watson coming in, he wasn't there last year. You're trying to build chemistry for his new team with some of those wideouts, the backfield you mentioned there. How does that kind of interrupt things in the middle of training camp, knowing that he's not going to be there at least early on in the season?
Well, you treat it like an injury, right? Sometimes you get a player that's going to be gone 4 to 6 weeks because of an injury. But the issue is that you really you don't have any more time for mistakes. It's one thing if Deshaun Watson had been at the Browns for a couple of years, the players knew him, but he's going to jump in Week 7. And typically in the NFL, from my 10-year experience, the game changes every 3 weeks. Something's different. Linebackers are picking up on something. Running backs are changing, things like that. So you want to be able to just run when Deshaun Watson gets back Week 7. That's a big game against the Ravens. And it's also going to be super awkward to go to Houston. I think it's Week 13. That's going to be a strange time. But if you're a player on the Browns roster, you know there's even less room for error in the NFL this season because when Deshaun Watson gets back, there's no way he's going to be in game shape. There's no way he's going to be ready to make excellent plays. And you're going to have even less time to correct the mistakes because you're already heading towards a bye after that first game.
If you're in the fray here, like Kevin Stefanski, he's been answering the questions there about Deshaun Watson. When is he going to be available? How are you approaching this? From a coaching perspective, how is he approaching now knowing that Watson won't be there the first half of the season?
Well, the good thing for the Browns is they've been splitting reps with Jacoby Brissett and Deshaun Watson. They were anticipating, even in training camp, something like this happening. But then now, if you're Kevin Stefanski, you're looking at what does Jacoby Brissett do best? And oh, by the way, let's use our running backs, Nick Chubb and others. So let's get the running game really going. Let's make sure our offensive line is healthy. You might want to give your offensive line a break or two to make sure that they can continue to be fresh for the season. But you want to put Jacoby Brissett in a position for him to excel, make quick decisions, and rely on the run game. And as far as him answering questions, I mean, that's the whole point for this Browns team. My thing has been you can't run from the questions being asked. The Browns put themselves in this situation by trading for Deshaun Watson. They have to answer the questions as they come. And unfortunately for the players on the roster, this is still a distraction. And hopefully for those who have had the alleged actions of Deshaun Watson, they're getting some peace of mind that justice has been served.
Watson getting that guaranteed $230 million in that trade coming from Houston to the Browns, and will miss the first 6 games. That ruling coming down here moments ago this morning. As always, Ryan Harris, appreciate you on the breaking news there. Want to take a look at that schedule. As we mentioned, weeks 1 through 6, he will not be available. Suspended the first 6 games. His first game back will be week 7 at the Ravens. Also, one thing to highlight there, as Ryan mentioned, you can circle week 13 as well, returning back to Houston. We know how that kind of went down with the Texans, but we'll see how it ends for the Browns this season, who are a team that wanted to contend, but will be missing QB1 the first 6 games of 2022.
All right, if you're just joining us here, we got some breaking news on CBS Sports HQ. Our NFL insiders have been hard at work, been able to deliver with us the information we've been waiting for with Deshaun Watson, where retired Judge Sue Robinson suggesting here that Deshaun Watson did violate the league's personal conduct policy and is suggesting the 6-game variety here. The NFLPA has said it will not appeal. The NFL, in terms of the league, going to have a few days to do that. So let's go ahead and bring in insider Jonathan Jones to deliver that. JJ, what more can you tell us about the latest with Deshaun Watson?
Yeah, it is 6 games for Deshaun Watson from retired federal judge Sue L. Robinson. Of course, she heard both sides, really all sides. It was Deshaun Watson and his legal team, Rusty Hardin. It was the NFLPA there to make sure that Deshaun Watson's due process rights, as laid out in the collective bargaining agreement, were followed. And then, of course, the NFL. Deshaun Watson and his legal team were pushing for 0 games, no suspension, no fine. The NFL was pushing for a suspension of at least 1 year, an indefinite suspension of at least 1 year. What that would mean is the league wanted him to be suspended not just for this year, but would then have to apply for reinstatement until or before he could return in 2023. But of course, as we now know, Judge Robinson has decided that it will be 6 games. I'm told that he will not face any fine. He will lose the game checks from those 6 games. You can do the quick math, and nearly a third of his $1 million or so base salary, so a little more than $300,000 he would lose out on. Of course, Tommy, we know that the Cleveland Browns structured the contract with Deshaun Watson with this potential inevitability where the suspension could happen and that it would lessen his financial hit. But in many people's eyes, this is just the next step. This is not necessarily the final step. Deshaun Watson and the NFLPA have said that they will not appeal. The NFL has 3 days to appeal it, and it would go to Roger Goodell or someone that Roger Goodell decides to appoint on whether this suspension is upheld or whether the NFL imposes whatever suspension it wants to.
All right, so there's a few things to unpack here, but you laid that out nicely. And to your point, the $1 million salary structure for now, if you looked at total $230 that he's supposed to make, it's well under 1% of what he could lose here from those 6 game checks at $330K per game. You talked about the league here. Given the opportunity to have this window, what's your understanding of whether they will then take that option to appeal or not?
That is really the big question that everyone wants to know. It's something that the NFL has not shown their hand in. Talking with sources on multiple sides of this yesterday. There was the belief that this would not be a year-long suspension. There's also the belief that it wouldn't be no suspension, that it would not be 0 games. And so talking with one source just moments before the news dropped, told me I think it's going to be about 6 games. And of course, it came out that way. That's the way that it was trending, where it would be about half of a season if you asked people to project it yesterday, as I did. So what will the NFL do? Will they be, are they swayed by what the NFLPA and Deshaun Watson put out in a statement yesterday about we will not appeal, and we call on the NFL to respect this process? You know, this is the first time, Tommy, that we've seen a suspension under this new CBA and sort of how this is playing out. Before, it was Roger Goodell as judge, jury, and executioner. Well, now what you have is an arbitrator who is the judge on the front end, but then Roger Goodell now has the opportunity to operate as an appeals court. And so will the NFL take it up? Is this a fight that they wish to take up? You know, the NFLPA has said that they believe that all sides were heard. They respect this process. But frankly, the NFL can do whatever it wants. It is empowered by a CBA that was passed by the players who are unionized. So we are all waiting to see here in the next day, 2, or up to 3 days whether an appeal will take place.
All right, so I know that the Browns would have loved to have seen no games, as you alluded to, but how disappointed, or maybe how are they viewing the 6-game scenario, you think, from a team perspective and the facility and the building this morning?
Well, I know that the Browns were anticipating certainly that a suspension very, very likely would take place. Again, their actions speak loudly to that by structuring the contract the way that they did. You know, if they weren't expecting anything, they would have structured this contract in a much more normal way, right? And so, in talking with folks in that building, really anything close to a half season was a win for the Browns, especially when you consider how the winds have changed over the past, let's call it 6 weeks. You know, there was a time I remember very vividly where folks around the league thought that Deshaun Watson was for sure going to be suspended for a year. And then there was a time where it was really a week later that it turned into, okay, it'll be 4 games. And really the last couple of weeks, the winds around the NFL have sort of settled on this 6 to 8 games. And so here we are with 6 games. The Cleveland Browns have been prepared to move forward with Jacoby Brissett. They obviously needed to bolster their quarterback group, and so they got Josh Rosen to compete with Josh Dobbs there as the number 3 quarterback, if you want to call it that. Really number 2 quarterback for the start of the season, since Deshaun Watson will not be there. And the Browns believe enough in Jacoby Brissett, and he just needs to go out there and not lose them games through the first 6 games, if that's what it is, of the season, until Deshaun Watson can come back. But Tommy, I'll tell you this. One of the interesting things is now Kevin Stefanski and the Browns, they say they have a plan. How many first-team reps are you going to give Jacoby Brissett, knowing that he's going to lead this team through the first 6 games at least of the season, versus how do you try to get Deshaun Watson ready? Because once you enter week 1 of preparation for the NFL season, Deshaun Watson's not out there on the field, but you want him to be able to hit the ground running week 7 when he returns. You want him to have chemistry with his receivers and tight ends and all that. So that's something that Kevin Stefanski, the head coach, is going to have to figure out very quickly on how best to situate this team moving forward.
JJ, I got one more before I let you go, and it is something that's talked about and circulating on social media right now, and it gets back to our point of sort of this is the new way things are going to be done when it comes to issues like Deshaun Watson and issues like a Calvin Ridley for gambling. Everyone's saying he's getting a year. Deshaun Watson here getting 6 games. What are you anticipating the process will be like, or at least, again, something you're looking out for and how this whole thing will play out in the future?
Yeah, the league office is very aware of the disparity here, right? That you bet a few games, an 11-game parlay on your phone while you're, not playing football. And you get a year-long suspension. That's just something that we around professional sports have known as a no-no. But it's very clear that you have very serious accusations of sexual misconduct from 24 women. 23 of the 24 have now settled with Deshaun Watson, versus placing a couple parlay bets on your phone. And so one gets 6 games, the other gets at least 1 season. I understand that. I don't have a good response to that. And frankly, if you were to pose that to someone who is employed by the NFL, I'm not entirely sure that they have a great response to that, one that would really make a ton of sense to the average person. However, Deshaun Watson, it should be said, was grand juried twice, was never charged with any crime despite these allegations, very serious allegations. These have been settled, 23 of 24 in the civil courts. And so there is that, Tommy. I can understand why people would ask that question, and I frankly have no good response to it.
Yeah, but we'll just look at how it all plays out. And as you mentioned, 23 of the 24, with 3 of those 4 happening just before this news came down. Our thanks to our insider, Jonathan Jones, again with the very latest on the situation surrounding Deshaun Watson and the Cleveland Browns. Again, 6 games is the information that we have now, with the option for the league to appeal within 3 days. The schedule looks like this. First game back for Deshaun Watson, if all things hold, would be at the Ravens in Week 7. You also have a game in Houston against the Texans in Week 13.
I want to bring in Ryan Wilson to break this down. And Ryan, the breaking news, of course, that Deshaun Watson will miss the first 6 games. Your reaction to that coming down this morning?
Brendan, it feels about what we expected, and it was just mostly speculation the last months, it feels like, to get to this point. 8 games was sort of the starting point, and if you thought maybe that Judge Robinson would be a little more in favor of what Deshaun Watson was presenting case-wise, maybe a little less than that. If you thought perhaps she would lean more towards what the league reportedly wanted, which was an indefinite suspension, at least of 1 year, then perhaps a little north of those 8 games. So 6 games feels about right in terms of what we expected. Now, you can argue about whether it was enough or not enough in terms of the actual punishment, but I think now and Jonathan Jones just mentioned that this is sort of the first step. The league can appeal this because there was a penalty imposed, and the appeal goes to Roger Goodell. And we sort of understand how this works historically before the new CBA in terms of naming a judge and arbiter to see this thing. Historically, it was Roger Goodell to make these decisions, and that didn't go over well with the union. So the union came out yesterday and said, we will accept this decision no matter what. Encouraged the league to do so. The league had no public response, and we'll see how they move forward with this. It would not be surprised if they get a temperature in terms of how fans react and then decide whether to press forward with an appeal of this 6-game suspension.
Of course, again, as you mentioned, the NFL does have 3 days to appeal this possible suspension of 6 games when it comes to Deshaun Watson. Looking in-house here, without QB1 there, you can easily say Jacoby Brissett, who was signed in the offseason, will be taking over for the first 6 games, at least as it stands right now. How does this kind of pan out for the Browns? They kind of planned for it, bringing him in, but how does this team look with him now taking over while Watson is out of the house?
He's a steady backup, and I think that's not a terrible thing to have on your roster. He's probably slightly less than replacement level if he were to start 17 football games. But again, that's why he's a backup. I think in a perfect world, in terms of ability and understanding the offense, you would like to have Baker Mayfield, or at least his ability. There's no way that was ever going to happen. But I think Jacoby Brissett's a step down from Baker Mayfield, but the two sides obviously parted ways for reasons that are clear to everyone. But I think, what do you have in Jacoby Brissett? You have someone who's going to understand the offense, who's going to be a leader in the huddle, who's going to be a leader in the locker room, who's going to have people in the right positions to make plays. And most importantly, perhaps, we heard Ryan Harris talk about this a few moments ago, the Browns are going to have to lean on the running game, and that running game is absolutely stacked. We'll see if the Browns are interested in moving on from Kareem Hunt or Dearness Johnson. I think maybe you hold on to those guys for at least those 6 games that Deshaun Watson is currently suspended. The good news, Brandon, in terms of on-the-field football, is that those 6 games only include 1 division game, and that's that Thursday night game against the Steelers, and only 2 games against teams that went to the playoffs last year, 1 being the Patriots and 1 being Pittsburgh. And they also play the Chargers, a team that somehow missed the playoffs, even though they should have gone to it. After that, you have those 2 games against division rivals at Baltimore, and then you play Cincinnati. And Deshaun Watson will be back as we sit here in weeks 7 and 8. And then you have your bye week to get ready for the rest of the second half of that season. And something else to keep in mind is that whenever Deshaun Watson ends up playing, whenever this is finally settled, whether the NFL decides to appeal or not, Deshaun Watson has not played football since 2020. He obviously sat out all of last season, and he'll miss at least 6 games of this season. So when he does come back, you would imagine there will be some rust. So that'll be something else that Kevin Stefanski and the coaching staff will have to consider once they start divvying up these preseason snaps, these training camp snaps that now are primarily, I would imagine, going to feature Jacoby Brissett.
I was going to ask you that exactly. How do you get your QB1 ready when you still have Jacoby Brissett, that you want him to win some of those games the closer we get to week 4, 5, and 6, and then you bring Watson back in the fold? How does that kind of work for Kevin Stefanski and the staff to kind of make sure both guys are ready when they're called on?
I think if you know it's going to be at least 6 games, there's not going to be a situation where the NFL appeals and Roger Goodell reduces the punishment. That seems a bit far-fetched. I think you have Jacoby Brissett taking all the first-team reps, and then you work Deshaun Watson in with those second-team reps and go from there. Again, Deshaun Watson hasn't played since 2020, so it's not like a handful of reps now is going to vastly improve what we may see on the field 6 weeks from the start of the football season. I think with Jacoby Brissett, he needs to get familiar with these wide receivers, many of whom are young, many of whom are new to this team, including Amari Cooper. And, of course, you have Donovan Peoples-Jones, who's going to try to make that step that they need him to take. Anthony Schwartz is going to be an important player when he's healthy. So those are clear concerns. But I think it starts with getting Jacoby Brissett ready. Because, look, those 6 football games, the teams that we've seen that are on the schedule those first 6 weeks, they're beatable for the most part, even with Jacoby Brissett. So if you can find a way to win 3 football games by leaning on your run game, by leaning on that defense, and you have an opportunity to beat the Panthers, to beat the Jets, to beat the Falcons, those are 3 wins right there, and then steal another win in those next 3 games, which could be pretty tough between the Steelers, Chargers, and Patriots. You're in pretty good position if you're able to get Deshaun Watson back and have him look anything like he looked before that he was missed last season in 2021 and played in 2022 when 2020 when he had 33 touchdowns, just 7 interceptions on a Texans team that only won 4 football games.
If we're looking at the AFC North, you see it there week 7 with the Ravens, his debut, and then week 8, you're back with the AFC champs there in the Bengals there. If we're looking at that division as a whole right now, knowing their situation, Watson gone for 6, Jacoby Brissett taking over, where do they kind of stack up for you at this point?
So let's just go on the premise that 6 games is what this ends up being for Deshaun Watson. I think the Bengals are still the best team in that division based on what we saw last year, based on the development of Joe Burrow and those young receivers, including Jamar Chase, obviously. Then I think it's going to be the Ravens. Lamar Jackson has to get that deal done, but they did a lot of things this offseason, especially in the draft, in terms of putting players around Lamar Jackson on both sides of the ball. They lost Hollywood Brown, but they drafted 2 tight ends who can help right away. And then I think it's going to be the Browns. 2 years ago, the Browns were a good football team. Last year, they were supposed to be better, building on what they had in 2020, and it just didn't work. Baker Mayfield got hurt. He and Kevin Stefanski didn't appear to be on the same page for much of the second half of the season, and the wheels fell off. And then after that, I think it's the Steelers. They're trying to figure out the quarterback situation, whether it's Mitchell Trubisky or Kenny Pickett, their first-round pick, or even Mason Rudolph, who could end up being traded in the next few weeks. And I think they're probably, as we sit here, which seems like a weird thing to say about the AFC North and the Steelers, they're in last place looking up at those other 3 teams. A lot can change in the next 6 or 7 months, but I think as we sit here, Brandon, the Browns are probably the 3rd best team, only because they're not going to have Deshaun Watson until at least the 7th game of the football season.
You have some work there the first 6 weeks. By the way, a lot of people saying the first 6 games is maybe the easiest schedule among teams. We're looking at the Browns schedule there. As always, Ryan Wilson, appreciate you on the breaking news there. Suspended 5 games for Deshaun Watson. That is the ruling by Sue Robinson there. Coming down today, taking a look at the depth chart. The Browns have kind of stocked up on QBs. Jacoby Brissett in the offseason. Last week, Josh Rosen coming into the fold. Without Watson there, Jacoby Brissett likely starter as QB1. And then we have a battle when it comes to 2 between Dobbs and Rosen. Only 3 wins between those 2 guys over their past career so far.
We continue to follow breaking news here on CBS Sports HQ, where Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson is facing a 6-game suspension. The Players Association will not appeal. The league will have 3 days to do so under the new CBA. Again, this is a new way of things in terms of the way things are looked at, the way things are judged, and the impact it has on players and time that they will miss. Also, speaking of impact, we're talking about the odds for the Cleveland Browns when it comes from a odds makers and Vegas perspective. I can tell you that right now at Caesars Sportsbook, they're still 25-1 to win the Super Bowl. They're still 13-1 to win the AFC. Now, what has changed is that their division odds, which came in at 4-1 before the news, has been taken off the board, The entire division has been taken off the board, and their win total also not available at the moment at Caesars. All right, but before we get to all that, let's bring in our two-time Super Bowl champ, Brian McFadden. B-Mac, first off, 6 games is what's on the table right now. What's your reaction to the Deshaun Watson news?
Wow, he got off good. I mean, best case scenario for Deshaun Watson and the Cleveland Browns. And the reason why I say that is because he had over 20 women, basically saying he did something inappropriately to them, and being able to get off basically 6 games. I literally thought, Tommy, would be around double digits. I thought it would probably be around 10 to 12 based on some of the past situations that we've seen, similar to what Deshaun Watson was involved in. You look at Ezekiel Elliott, I think he got around 4 games for one incident. If you look at Big Ben, got around 4 games for one incident as well. Now, both guys were not legally charged, the same like Deshaun Watson, but they got 4 games. You telling me 20-plus women said Deshaun did something that he had no business doing. And of course, they all filed civil suits as well. And he settled with 20 women, if not mistaken, and he only got 6 ball games. So this is a huge win for Deshaun Watson. This is a huge win for the Cleveland Browns, because eventually they will get their franchise quarterback back in uniform, and he will be able to play the majority of the season. And then when you look at the financial side of things, remember his base salary this year was only $1 million. So he's basically losing out on over around $330,000 or something like that. A small loss based on when you look at the entire contract. And oh, by the way, his $44 million signing bonus won't be touched at all. I think he got 15 of that yesterday. So when it comes to the financial side of things, not getting fined anything extra from the NFL, only losing out on $300,000, and you still got your entire signing bonus intact. This was a win-win for Deshaun, was a win-win for the Cleveland Browns.
All right, we'll get to the odds in just a second. But again, you played the game at the highest level. You've won the Super Bowl. That's what the Cleveland Browns are trying to do. So it's my understanding that he's still going to be able to participate preseason. And then the way things work out, he can't participate the first 3 games of the suspension, but he can come back. So again, he could ramp up for Baltimore, which would be week 7. From a player's perspective, again, he's coming in, he's trying to help your team get to the playoffs and win a Super Bowl. From a player's and teammate perspective, what's that going to be like for him and the Cleveland Browns?
I mean, if you're a teammate of Deshaun Watson, you're excited of the news today because you still have everything in front of you that you would like to achieve. Understanding and knowing you have an experienced quarterback taking over in Jacoby Brissett. Defensively, you know that, of course, we gotta ball out. We gotta play better football. I can go back to, I think it was 2006 when I was there in Pittsburgh and we found out Big Ben was going to miss some ball games. The defense said, you know what, we gotta play lights out until we get our franchise quarterback back in the lineup. And they have some playmakers on the defensive side that can do some similar things to what we needed to do in Pittsburgh. And you look at the first 6 ball games, I mean, it's a 6-game stretch, but if you can come out of that stretch, 6 ball games, 3-3, you like that. You feel excited about what is going forward with the program. And then when you look at the thick of their schedule, that's when you get Deshaun Watson back, because they have a 5-game stretch where they're playing Baltimore, Cincinnati, Miami, Buffalo, and Tampa. And you have a bye in those ball games as well, in the midst of those ball games. So if you can get through that tough stretch with Deshaun Watson and come out on top somehow, I mean, everything is right there for you. Everything is right there for you. So me personally, when you look at the 6 games, Jacoby Brissett, if you can win 3 games, I mean, you did your job. Find a way to come out at least 500 in that 6-game stretch, Tommy, and you have to like their chances, especially if Deshaun Watson can get back to being the player that we last saw him perform like over a year ago when he was with the Houston Texans.
So then the question becomes, B-Mac, as we're taking a look at that schedule, how bullish are you on the Cleveland Browns? Again, 25-1 to win the Lombardi, 13 to win the AFC at the moment.
I'm not bullish at all because I think it's going to be a very, very difficult division. On the AFC North, when you're seeing defenses like the Pittsburgh Steelers twice a year, Baltimore, when they're healthy, we know what type of unit they can be. And of course, the improvements the Cincinnati Bengals made. I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And oh, by the way, your quarterback has been away from the game for a full year. And then when you factor in missing the first 6 ball games, and of course not being able to get all the reps that a starting quarterback will get throughout camp is probably going to hurt the chances of seeing the best Deshaun Watson that we potentially can see, because he's been away from the game for quite some time. So I expect to see some chemistry issues, some rhythm issues from Deshaun when he is in the lineup and he's back from his suspension. So because of all of that, I'm not quite ready to say, of course, they're Super Bowl caliber team. They should be the favorites to win their division. It's going to take some time for me to actually see with the eye test how he's looking in his new uniform in a new offense around new players.
Yeah, a lot of books had held off because of anticipation of this BMAC, and so some, not all, some had like the win total for the Browns at 9.5. So we'll see where the dust settles when we're able to know the information that we have in front of us. BMAC certainly appreciate it as always. Again, when you digest that schedule, 6 games without Deshaun Watson if everything is still upheld. Big game at the Ravens, Week 7. A return trip to Houston, Week 13 at the Texans. In terms of the odds, the Bengals, of course, are there. The Steelers, the Ravens, it's all there for the Cleveland Browns to deal with. But right now, it looks like, again, no Deshaun Watson for 6 weeks of the year.
Following that breaking news in the NFL when it comes to Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson set to serve a 6-game suspension if is upheld there for violating the league's personal conduct policy following accusations of sexual misconduct. That recommendation handed down by Sue L. Robinson. By the way, the NFLPA will not appeal, while the NFL, they have 3 days to find appeal there on the decision. Watson is facing additional fines, will not face additional fines, if he serves the full 6 games. His first debut will Week 7 against the Ravens on October 23rd for the Browns. Join us now, NFL insider Brady Quinn here. And of course, at one point we thought it was going to be a year suspension. There was talk of maybe 10 to 12. BMAC had mentioned that. Then there was that little hole of 6 to 8. Now we're at 6 games for Watson in 2022. Your reaction to that news coming down today?
Well, I think if you were following the reports, you knew it was leading this way. Now, the NFL had floated out there earlier this spring that they were pushing for a year-long suspension. I'm not even sure they really want that. I think they just wanted to leak that out there to let everyone know that they knew that was never going to be in play here. It was going to be at most maybe about half a season, if not a little bit less, and we end up at 6 games. So it's not overly surprising to hear the decision by Sue L. Robinson. I don't expect the NFL is going to appeal this, and I think everyone's going to move forward now and look forward to that opportunity for Deshaun Watson to get back on the field. Let's not mistake ourselves. The NFL is better when they have the faces of these franchises, and that's the quarterbacks as a part of them. And this has been the biggest story in the league now for almost 2 years. And so there's a lot of Cleveland Browns fans clamoring for him to get back. There's a lot of people who are curious to see what he's going to look like when he's back. So that's why I never really felt like you were going to see a long suspension here in play, even though that was reported and touted about for a little bit. I think that was more for optics than anything else. But, look, it's hard to compare this to anything else, as I've heard other analysts try to do. It's such a unique scenario that I don't think anything else that's happened outside of the realm of football or even within football, you can compare to this because it's so unique. I mean, who else has had 24 allegations or civil lawsuits, I should say, against him that he's had to settle, which I believe he's settled 23 of the 24 at this point and has been investigated on. I mean, it's unheard of at this point. I don't think we're ever going to see anything like this again. So it's not an easy position for Sue L. Robinson to be in. But at the end of the day, that's the punishment that she served forth. And we all just kind of have to wait and see how this plays out for the Cleveland Browns and Deshaun Watson.
Those first 6 games, I want to take a look at the schedule, of course, starting on the road against the Panthers. And then the last game of that suspension, if it's upheld there, taking on the Patriots, his first chance to debut against the Ravens here. And Brady, I want to pick your mind on this, playing the QB position. We are thinking about it here. The Browns may be preparing for this with Jacoby Brissett coming in the fold this offseason, signing him to a 1-year deal. But how does this mess up the camaraderie there that maybe Watson is somewhat built in training camp? Because put in perspective, he wasn't there last year. So this is a whole new ball game for him in Cleveland and those targets here when you talk about the Browns and their chances in 2022.
Yeah, but he's been there all offseason. They've been preparing him as he's going to be the starter. And so, I think the most interesting part of all this is going to be how they handle the preseason, because you've got a guy who didn't play last year. He's obviously not going to be able to play for the first 6 games of this season. How much do you elect to play him? The Browns have been a team that, I think amongst with some others, that they'd like to hold back their starters, maybe play them a little bit. But do you play Deshaun Watson a little more in the preseason to get his feet wet, to knock off some of the rust that he may have from not playing, because he's going to have to sit out those 6 games. Now, he will be able to come back after the first 3 weeks, start practicing again with the team to get back and develop that chemistry again. But, I think those are the concerns that you have in general for any quarterback or any player joining a team that's a new system, new players out around him. So that's no different than anyone else. I think the toughest thing for Jacoby Brissett is, he's got to stay healthy, and he's just got to give them a chance to win some of these games. Their first 4 games are not that difficult. I mean, they should be able to come away at least 500 if he just takes care of the football and is a good decision maker. With that ground attack, their defense, and some of the playmakers, he doesn't have to do a whole lot. Now, the last 2 of the suspension, that's where things get difficult. Obviously, taking on the LA Chargers, which are one of the more talented teams, and potentially fighting for the AFC West and a playoff spot this year, and then the New England Patriots, which we obviously know their track record with Bill Belichick and Mac Jones looking to prove on year 1. But the biggest key in all this is the Browns only miss 1 division game without Deshaun Watson. That's huge. Now, granted, he comes right back into 2 divisional games versus Baltimore and Cincinnati when he comes back from the suspension. But the truth of the matter is that's gigantic in regards to the Browns' playoff chances because, yeah, he's going to miss some time. And obviously that's going to hurt them because if he's on the field, he gives them the best chance to win. But if they can come out of that stretch, those first 6 games, 3-3, and allow him to come back for 5 divisional games, it gives them a chance to win the division, and it gives them a chance to get him that playoff spot.
Still a chance for them when you talk about the AFC North, as you mentioned there. Brady Quinn, as always, appreciate your time. On that breaking news, Deshaun Watson suspended the first 6 games of the season. Taking a look at that QB room, the Browns kind of beefing it up after he sent Baker Mayfield away. Jacoby Brissett coming in the offseason, Josh Dobbs, and then Josh Rosen added just last week, looking for that QB2 when it comes to those 2 individuals. Brissett, of course, elevated to QB1 with Watson gone the first 6 games. And then Dobbs and Rosen kind of duking it out there for QB2 and maybe options of playing this season in the preseason and into week 1.
We continue to follow breaking news here on CBS Sports HQ, where Cleveland Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson facing a 6-game suspension with no appeal from the Players Association. We're still waiting to see if the league will do so. They've got a few days to do that. Browns coach Kevin Stefanski had started training camp last week that if Deshaun Watson would not be available, Jacoby Brissett going to be the starter in the event of a suspension. So taking a look at the Browns depth chart, veterans like Watson and Brissett, Joshua Dobbs and Josh Rosen influxed and added into this group with, of course, Baker Mayfield leaving for the Carolina Panthers in the offseason. Spartanburg, South Carolina, by the way, is where Josina Anderson is, and we'll be talking about that for just a little bit. But before we do, Josina, our NFL insider, joining us here, what more can you tell us about your understanding of the decision handed down by Sue Robinson today?
So Sue Robinson just moments ago conveyed her decision in the Deshaun Watson proceeding to the relevant parties. And we have all heard since then that it is for 6 games. And this is after her independent review of the evidence from both sides relative to this case. Her review of thousands and thousands of documents of evidence from both sides as well. And this is where she has placed her flagpole on the spectrum of potential discipline rather. And so this right here also just lets us know kind of how she felt relative to everything presented in front of her. When you think about the fact that the NFL was going for an indefinite suspension and Deshaun Watson's side was advocating for 0 games. So she is just to the other side of that relative to the median with respect to the duration of a year long and also obviously 0, right? So I think that gives you some indication. And as you kind of hear some of the reaction just on social media, what have you, some people are relatively surprised. Some people feel like this is a good sign for Deshaun Watson and the Browns. Obviously, there are some people who are upset by it. But what's interesting now relative to the process is that both sides, presumably, at least per the process, have the ability to appeal to the commissioner, though we heard last night via statement from the union that Deshaun Watson and the union, as of that statement, intend to abide by the ruling of Sue Robinson and not appeal for the sake of underlining what they feel should be the maintained neutrality of the process and what they fought for in this version of the CBA in comparison to what it was before, when Roger Goodell was the judge and the jury. So that's what they're trying to underline. But we are now waiting to see if the NFL will make a decision to appeal to the commissioner, ironically, whether they feel like there should be an adjustment or modification to the ruling based on the evidence that they presented in the arbitration hearing. So we will see. But some other quick reaction, behind the scenes, just from a leak source, one of the things that I heard somebody tell me is they felt like Sue Robinson's ruling was more representative of a moderator and not an arbiter. So very interesting to hear that. And I think that people are still, matter of fact, I know based on what they're telling me, still waiting to read the full decision from Sue Robinson and to fully grasp the logic behind her ruling and philosophy behind that. And I think we just kind of have to wait and see just to make sure that everything is going to proceed the way we heard it last night.
That's exactly where I was going to go, because a lot of people are asking how and why she got to the 6 games. What's the process there? Is she going to release something written? Is there a protocol in terms of when she has to maybe make that available to journalists and obviously fans to learn about?
So a couple of things that's very interesting. If you're reading the new language in the CBA, so basically right now, if we're going along the word of the NFLPA and their intentions as of last night not to appeal, then per the CBA, the NFL has 3 days to submit a written appeal to Roger Goodell, and then the response would come 2 days after that. So if they are going to do that, the clock is about 5 days on that, right? And then the other interesting thing relative to her decision to do 6 games, we all have to wait to see the written language in the decision, but at least in the personal conduct policy, in the discipline section, there is language about a baseline of 6 games when certain aspects of discipline are included in the type of quote unquote violation, like if there's some sort of, at least per the language in the personal conduct policy, if there's some sort of violence, or if it is related to a sexual misconduct, for example, in nature. Now, obviously, one of the things that did come out, at least prior to this decision, per the reporting that we had, and also others, that backed it up as well, that the NFL didn't present any evidence of physical force or coercion or things like that. So it'll be interesting to see, very much so per the language in the personal conduct policy and the baseline that they could have when the violation is related to sexual misconduct or the allegations of such, and whether her decision is based on that being invoked or if it just comes from something else based on her reasoning. Because as we know, the language in the personal conduct policy is very, the language in the personal conduct policy is very broad, and you could be found to have been in violation of that simply for being irresponsible.
All right, looks like that generator, maybe your light is out, but we still got you, Josina, so we're going to keep you on if we can, as long as we can,
no
and we'll look when we get
problem.
that on for you. What's your understanding of what he can participate in now that we know, of course, he's going to be missing 6 games, preseason, during the season? What's the latest on that front?
So per my understanding, and I don't have this all the way for sure, just because it is a relative new process, but my understanding is, as we are going through the potential appeals process, that he would still be allowed to participate. I know that once he is on officially the commissioner's suspended list, that on the back half of whatever that suspension is when he could then come back and participate. Now, what I have been trying to clarify relative to this new process is if the player, that being Deshaun Watson, gets placed on the commissioner's suspended list immediately, or if that is done right at the start of the regular season relative to the conclusion of the appeal process. That's the only part that is not clear for me right now.
So we have been sort of learning about the salary structure that the Browns have anticipated this with, Josina, and obviously also looking for insurance. They had one in Baker Mayfield, the former top overall pick. Again, he's now with the Panthers where you are again. How do you best describe sort of the front office and what they were doing in anticipation of getting Deshaun Watson and the way that they've done things in lieu of what we're seeing today?
So obviously much has been made of Deshaun Watson's record contract, getting a 5-year, $230 million deal, record in the nature of the total, record in the nature of the fact that it is fully guaranteed. And obviously there was a lot of talk about the fact that the money that he's making for his 2022 compensation is only $1,000,035. And so a lot of people were wondering if the club rather specifically did that to mitigate the amount of money that Deshaun would lose relative to the suspension in this year. Now, since that information came out about the contract, the club, that being the Cleveland Browns, has specified over and over again that that structure is something common to what they do for many contracts, not just Deshaun Watson. So that would be the answer to that. And that is true. Deshaun Watson is not unique in having the first year be dropped down to a minimum base salary, but it just coincidental, at least per the reasoning from the club, that it also helps to mitigate Deshaun Watson's losses.
Josina, I'll get you out of here on this. Again, we're talking about having journalists and insiders like yourself navigate through all this new language, navigate through the new protocol and the process. What are you looking out for here in the next steps and trying to learn more about Deshaun Watson and his status?
Well, I think the thing here is to see if the NFL is going to indeed appeal or not, and if by doing so undermine the arbitrator, that being Sue Robinson, in her first case underneath this process. Now, one thing I know about covering many of these cases over 10, 15 years relative to the old process, but still I think pertinent about the league, is that they are always, in my opinion, surveying the landscape of how people are reacting and getting the pulse and the optics out there. I'm sure that they will huddle behind the scenes at Park Avenue in New York. I'm sure that they're going to thoroughly go through her decision and the written ruling from Sue Robinson and make a determination from there. But my eyes will be on that as far as the NFL's decision. And then from there to double check and still make sure that Deshaun Watson's side is still indeed, although I just heard even minutes before doing this live shot for you guys that that was the intention. Although, like I've heard from sources, people are still waiting to read that in writing.
All right, Josina Anderson joining us again with the very latest. Josina, appreciate the latest information and the insight. Again, so many new moving parts that we are dealing with, and a high-profile athlete, quarterback, face, and situation there with Deshaun Watson in Cleveland. Again, if all things hold and things do not change, Week 7 at the Ravens, and then followed up by the Bengals on Monday Night Football would be the first 2 games for Deshaun Watson as quarterback of the Cleveland Browns. Also a trip back to Houston for the Texans back in Week 13 for a Browns team fighting with the Bengals, Ravens, and Steelers in the AFC North.
Following that breaking news, the NFL, when it comes to Sue L. Robinson's decision to suspend Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson for 6 games, that's been confirmed by our NFL insiders Josina Anderson and Jonathan Jones this morning. By the way, the NFLPA will not appeal, while the NFL, they do have 3 days to file an appeal. That, of course, falling in the hands of Commissioner Roger Goodell. Watson also is not facing any additional fines. Now, if he does serve the full 6-game suspension, he would be able to make his debut for the Cleveland Browns in 2022 against the Baltimore Ravens in late October on the 23rd, which is Week 7 of their schedule. Joining us now, we got Scott Pioli and Charles Davis. And Scott, I'll start with you. Your expectations or reactions to this news today, the 6 games, because at one point we thought it would be a year, maybe double digits, but now we're set on 6 here after that news today.
Yeah, my reaction to this is it's complicated. You know, there's a lot of layers to this situation, and there's information in layers that I'm not smart enough to figure out or be informed enough to have. And there's a judge that's in place that made a decision, you know, and this judge knows the law far better than me. This judge knows all of the information far better than me. So I take this moment and then I compartmentalize, and I have to look at it from my front office view. Again, I'll just say, from where I sit, I'm not sure I agree with it, and I don't know all the information. Again, a very, very complicated situation for the NFL right now. So now as you sit there as a team, you've got this bit of information. Now the team needs to sit and say, okay, what is the league going to do? Are they going to go with the 6 games? Are we going to move forward? What are we going to do? And if you're the Cleveland Browns, you're sitting in a situation right now, well, that's only 6 of our games. We've got to find a way to win a couple of those. And then when Deshaun is back, we'll hopefully win some more.
Scott, I love how you articulate just how difficult this is and how complicated it is, because there's so many layers to it. There's so many different ways of going about it. If I just take it and Brandon just say, okay, if the question is, what's your reaction to the game suspension, the number, what have you? For me, it's zero surprise, like absolute zero. I know that there was this talk about him getting a year, that potentially the league was going after a year. Once the criminal charges went away, quote unquote, I never thought that would actually happen. I thought that might be a goal. I thought the number would be 6 to 8, and it's right into that number. So this is zero surprise whatsoever. But going back to where Scott's talking about how complicated it is, as the front office person, if Scott's the GM of Cleveland, you have to understand they've done their work already, meaning they've gone through contingencies. How many games? What's it going to be? Who's our backup situation? When does he get back when you're able to? Does that mean he's out for preseason? Does it mean this? How will we work our practices to make sure that the new starter will be ready to go, supposedly Jacoby Brissett, and right on down the line, not to mention you're discussing fan reaction. How do we do this as an organization? What's the message we send out, et cetera? So there's so many things to it. Scott, he gave us a great synopsis of just how complicated and layered this whole thing is. But as far as the game number, as I said before, zero surprise. I thought 6 to 8 from day one, and it hit right in there.
Scott, I would actually piggyback off that and put you in that front office perspective. When you look at it, a situation like this, very unique, as you guys both have outlined it a little bit. But are you looking at this and maybe handling this as maybe a player injury when you may have your guy missing for 4 or 5 weeks? And as Charles said there, you have a Jacoby Brissett that you signed in the offseason. You just picked up Josh Rosen as well. How are you actually day by day going by this at least to week 6 or week 7 once you get Watson back?
Like I said, the most important part, Josina just mentioned this prior to us coming on air, is they now have to find out, or as a general manager, you're waiting to find out, does the suspension begin immediately, or is the suspension going to be like other suspensions where it doesn't start until the first day of the regular season? Because this fact is, if he's not suspended immediately, they've got the entire preseason for Deshaun to work in practice with his teammates in preseason games to learn to get your offense going, to get people on the same page. And then the way other suspensions work, boom, it starts the first day of the regular season. Is he going to be in the facility? Is he not going to be in the facility? Are they going to allow him around? Will he practice? He probably won't practice. So you've got to start to take some of that information. But to answer the question, this is treated really, it's different but similar to a player being on PUP or any other suspension, because you're going to not have the player for the games, but he can be around the facility potentially, depending on what the league's ruling is, and he won't be able to practice. So during that time, he's getting in shape. He's around the teammates. Maybe he's not. Again, there's still so much more information, but it's treated like, again, if a player is coming off an injury from the previous season and they're on PUP and they can't play for a certain segment of the season, it's different than an injury that happens right now, because those things surprise you. They are not surprised. They have been able to do a lot of contingency planning to get themselves to the situation, not only for training camp, but in their minds, they knew that there was going to be some degree of a suspension. And I'm right where Charles is. I'm not surprised by the number at all, based on what the league and what the judge did and what the league is going to do. So to me, this has been, it's an awful situation, big picture, on so many levels. But for the Browns, this is now a good situation.
A lot of details to unfold there when it comes to those 6 games, as well as if he can participate in preseason and training camp. A little difficult to figure that out the closer we get to week 1. And Charles, you, of course, will be on the call week 1 there against the Panthers for the Browns. Your expectations of what this team will look like, not just week 1, but the first 6 games into the season for them.
Well, Brandon, for me, this is still a good roster. I mean, this is a team that went to the playoffs in 2020, and it was a disappointment they didn't make it last year for a variety of reasons. We know the injuries kicked in, other things affected it, but they were a team that had high hopes, and those hopes are not going away. And what would be interesting for me is us on the outside. We're looking at those first 6 games, and I think we are, and I wonder if Scott would concur. We're from the outside saying, hey, can they just hang in there? Can they get a split in the first 6? But if you're Kevin Stefanski as a head coach, if you're Andrew Berry as a general manager, if you're the Haslam family, you're not sitting there wanting the message to go to your team, hang on till the savior gets here. You're trying to win all those games right here, right now. You know Deshaun Watson's going to be your quarterback starting with game 7, but you're not looking at that and just saying, guys, if we can just hang in there. No, you're going in and saying we have to attack our schedule. We know the Baker Mayfield game comes right out of the gate. That just adds another layer to what you're doing, but that doesn't affect you as a team. That affects us on the outside. Bottom line is, it's almost like I could see Dick Vermeil, Coach Vermeil, going to the Hall of Fame now. We're going to move forward with Jacoby Brissett. But that's what they have to do. They have to move forward. You remember when Coach Vermeil said that they're going to move forward with Kurt Warner? Scott remembers it well. Unfortunately, how well did they move forward? They moved forward with Kurt Warner, and that team went to a Super Bowl, and then Scott's team got them the next time out. So that's how it works. That's how the team has to go about it. It'll be very interesting to me, though, because we're going to write all the stories about, can they get a split? The Browns aren't thinking split. They want to be the best they can be before Deshaun Watson gets back.
Hoping Jacoby Brissett could just not lose games. That's the plan there as we get closer to week 1 there. As always, Scott Pioli and Charles Davis breaking that down, the suspension for 6 games for Deshaun Watson. Heading into week 1, taking a look at the QB depth chart again. Watson, of course, out suspended for those first 6 games. That ruling coming down this morning by Sue L. Robinson. That decision, of course, could be appealed. The NFL has 3 days to do so. So Roger Goodell in the driving seat when it comes to that. Outside of that, QB2 now elevated to 1. Jacoby Brissett, as we just talked about, a proven winner, 14-23. And then when it comes to QB2 without Watson, Dobbs and Rosen will have a chance at that the closer we get to the season.
The Cleveland Browns, as it stands, will be without Deshaun Watson for the first 6 games of the season. Now that can change. There can be an appeal from the league, but as of right now, the Players Association is okay with the decision. They will not appeal, at least from that standpoint. And then the question now becomes, what's the fantasy impact for managers who want to maybe take a flyer on Deshaun Watson? And I say flyer, meaning early, because of course he will make it on rosters. The only question becomes how early and when. And that's a question that we have Jamie Eisenberg on here for with the return of fantasy football today, our senior fantasy analyst joining us here. So, Jamie, the perspective that comes with Deshaun Watson, if it is 6 games, how does that settle with most of the fantasy community right now?
Tommy, I think you're going to see him still drafted as a number 1 quarterback. Obviously the fact that you're missing the first 6 games is clearly not ideal. But if there is a position that you can sort of overcome and have a lot of depth for and find a quality starter to get you through those first 6 games, it's at quarterback. And so I think he's still going to be on a per game basis, a top 10 caliber fantasy quarterback. I'm going to rank him as a top 12 guy, so a back end starter. And when you get past really the top 10 or so quarterbacks, there's a group of about 5 or 6 guys now that Watson joins, and he would be ahead of them clearly if he was playing a full 17-game season. But he's in that group with Kirk Cousins and Derek Carr and Matthew Stafford, Aaron Rodgers, Trey Lance, guys that can certainly be league winners. But clearly you got to factor in that you're missing those first 6 games. So Watson's got so much upside, so much potential as a fantasy quarterback. And now that we have the timetable of when he's going to return, now you can draft him accordingly.
Interesting. You bring up some of the names, right? Some veterans like Carr. But what about guys like maybe a Fields, or maybe people want Tua, maybe more of an upside play if that's what you're looking for? What conversations or thought process would you have in terms of maybe if you're drafting and that's the bunch that's sort of in front of you your next turn there?
Yeah, I would take Watson ahead of those guys, but in terms of if you're talking about pairing those guys with Watson, Fields certainly qualifies as well. The thing you want to look for clearly is, early schedule that's in the quarterback's favor, obviously healthy and proven receiving core, so there are things you don't want to be dealing with. You don't want to be dealing with a guy that's, sort of struggling and has to get themselves, set and establish themselves, and then you get a second season boost. You're hoping for that from Watson. So I think just when you're looking at it, from how you're going to approach your draft, you draft Watson first, and then you kind of figure out the second guy later. So Jameis Winston, Tua Tagovailoa, Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence, it's such a deep position. You're going to see even, some good weeks early in the season from guys like Davis Mills and Jared Goff and maybe even Matt Ryan as well. So it's very easy to swing for the fences at quarterback. And Deshaun Watson, when he's on the field, even the fact that he hasn't played in, a season and a half, by the time he steps on the field, he's still going to be a difference maker. And I think that's the type of player you want on your team.
What impact, if any, in the approach for you would suggest to some of our managers here in terms of the running backs, the wide receivers, anything that comes from this suspension here?
I never really changed them, whether it was going to be a full season suspension for Watson or he was playing from week one. I think you just look at this offensive line is awesome. Kevin Stefanski's system is tried and true. They work well together. And so Nick Chubb is the first one you take, and he's going at the end of round 2 or beginning of round 3, depending on format. Most of us play in PPR, so beginning of round 3 is where I think you'll see his average draft position go. I think that's a good spot for him because when Kareem Hunt is healthy, clearly that cuts into what Nick Chubb is able to do. And as we've heard and as we know, he's got 2,000-yard potential. He certainly can lead the league in rushing, but the fact that they have 2 guys, and in some cases they may have 3 guys if they use Dearness Johnson, it's going to just pull back a little bit on what Nick Chubb does. He's just not a huge factor in the passing game as well. Kareem Hunt was amazing last year before he started dealing with injuries. Can he stay healthy? Can he get enough touches? He falls to more in the number 3 running back range, but somebody you can certainly use as a flex. And as we know, he's the ultimate lottery ticket. Should Nick Chubb miss any time, Kareem Hunt's going to be an absolute superstar. And then we'll find out between Dearness Johnson, who they brought back, and Jerome Ford. We still could see a trade potentially happen in training camp if some team needs running back depth and they get good value in return. So that's something to keep an eye on. But I think the top 2 guys. So Chubb and Hunt are very serviceable. Chubb's the guy you're drafting first.
Jamie, certainly appreciate it. We're looking forward to FFT coming up at noon Eastern here on CBS Sports HQ. Dave Richard, Heath Cummings, Adam Azer. Again, Jamie telling us she's got Deshaun Watson as a top 12 quarterback. I know Dave and Heath have already taken to the fantasy rankings on CBSSports.com, updated theirs. I think Heath had him a little more higher, Watson at 10, Richard at 16 for Dave. So again, more on that coming up on the podcast as well, and FFT on HQ later today.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.